Okay. All right, we are good. All right, so let's go ahead and open in prayer. Yes, Mike. Fantastic. Thank you. All right. All right, so let's go ahead and open in prayer. God, again, we are just so thankful for an opportunity to meet. We're thankful for the people that are here. We're thankful for the health of everyone that is here, God, that you allowed us to come. We just pray for any needs that are here, whether they be physical, financial, or spiritual, God. We just pray that your presence would be here tonight. We pray that you'd help us to understand through the history between the Old Testament and the New Testament, your plan and how that prepared us for the fullness of the coming of Christ. So I just pray that you would bless this group tonight. Bless my words in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. So a couple things really quickly. For those of you that are online, if you can make sure that you mute yourself, and then I will stop and I will pause and ask if there's questions. If there's questions, bring yourself off mute, but just make sure that you're on mute so we don't get any background conversations or noises going. The other thing would be for the people that are in here is if you got a question, just say, I got a question, and then I'll come over. Last week, I guess we had some problems with people hearing the questions from the background. So I'll make sure that I come with the mic and we can make sure that everyone online hears the questions that you have as well. The other thing, again, is that we are in a series here. It's based off of the 4-volume work of Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum from Ariel Ministries. It is called The Life of the Messiah from a Messianic Jewish Perspective. The content and the structure is his. Of course, if you know me, you know I'm going to add a whole bunch of my own stuff in there, but the general stuff is going to be presented is going to come from that. So if you want to, if you're kind of a studier and you want to get the book, you can either get the 4-volume book or you can get the abridged version, which I highly recommend as a 1-volume book that will also lead you through this. So when we left off last week, we started talking about the need for us to look at the historical backgrounds of the Romans, the Greeks, and the Jewish background. Because without that knowledge, we have that 400-year gap between the end of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And without that knowledge, you're going to immediately step into the New Testament and you're going to be met with a whole bunch of people and situations and practices that aren't in the Old Testament. And it's going to be very hard for us to understand who are these characters, who are these Sadducees, where did they come from? Why are the Jewish people so longing for the Messiah to come? And you're going to find this out through the study of history.
Well, you see, like, so there was the head. And then
can we mute, if you're online, can we please mute you? Can you please mute yourself, I guess? I don't want to mute you, but mute yourself, please. Thank you. All right. So that's kind of where we're at. And we also want to see, here's the one thing I want to do. We are going to go through some history here, but I don't want you to look at this as just dates and things, right, that happen. I want you to think about how did God prepare the way? Because the Bible, the New Testament says that in the fullness of time, or at the right time, Christ came. When the right things had been checked off God's list, and he says, now's the time. Not 100 years before, not 200 years after, but at that time, and according to the prophecies of Daniel, the Messiah was going to come. So what are the things historically that lead us up to it being the fullness of time for Christ to come? Right? So that's what we want to talk about. So it's not just a list of kind of dates and things that happen. So let me start off with the background, the initial Jewish background. If you remember correctly, we have what is called the United Kingdom, and that is the kingdom of David and, of course, of Solomon. That's where the entire nation of Israel was united under the kingship of David and Solomon. And then, of course, you know, when Solomon died, his kingdom was split into the northern kingdom of Samaria, right, and to the southern kingdom of Judah, split between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, right? And so in 931, we get this divided kingdom that occurs. And then because of that divided kingdom, we've now got kind of two sets of Jewish groups that are working as kind of side by side. And what we have is the Assyrians in 722, 721, they end up conquering the northern kingdom, right? That's the 10 northern tribes. So they conquer them and they put them under Assyrian control. Now they almost captured the southern kingdom, right? The southern kingdom almost fell as well, but they didn't. They managed to survive. So the northern kingdom goes under Assyrian control. Now, we have then in 586, we have the southern kingdom that survives until then. And in 586, what we have is we have the Babylonians, who have now supplanted the Assyrians as the dominant world force. And so the Babylonians come in and they defeat the Assyrians, and then they take over and capture Judah, which are the southern two tribes of Judah and Benjamin, right? And one of the things to kind of keep in mind here is that sometimes you'll hear people talk about these lost tribes of Israel, which is just a bunch of baloney, because the tribes are never lost. The 10 tribes were taken under Assyrian captivity. So they were under Assyrian control. When the Babylonians came, they took over the Assyrians' territory, and then they brought in 2 new tribes, which was Judah, right, and Benjamin. So when they took the Assyrians, who already had the Jewish people. So there was 12 tribes that were under the Babylonian control, not just 2, right? And so we have this going on here. Now, what happened also when the Babylonians came, and this will be important for us in the New Testament, is that the Edomites, who were southwest of Israel, they got pushed up into southern Israel, into Judah. No, the southern kingdom. Okay, the Edomites, so you've got the northern kingdom, you've got the southern kingdom, and then you've got the Edomites here. The Edomites got pushed up into the southern kingdom of Judah. So they actually were pushed up into Israelite territory. That's the Edomites. And they were called the Idumeans. Now, I don't know if you know who was one of the most famous Idumeans in New Testament history. Anyone know? Okay, you'll find out in a minute here. Anyway, so they get pushed up into this area called Idumea. And then what happens is that the Babylonians rule and reign for a while. And then, of course, about 50 years later, we have the Medes and Persians. Of course, you get that when the Medes and Persians came in Daniel, you see the whole thing of God's handwriting on the wall, right? And they fall that very night. So in 536, the Medes and Persians come in and they wipe out the Babylonian Empire. And so now all 12 tribes are under Medo-Persian control. And one of the things I want you to think about here is how long the Jewish people are under domination of a foreign power. It's going to be a long time, 700 years. So when Christ comes, just keep this in mind. When Christ comes, you have a people group that has been dominated by foreigners for over 700 years. They are dying for a Messiah. They are crying out to be saved because they have not known independence other than a short 80-year period, the Maccabean period. They have not known independence from a foreign power. And there are some of the powers that were a little better to live under and some that were much worse, but they were all bad because you're all being dominated by that. So as we go through this history, put yourself in the place of a Jewish person, particularly a New Testament Jew that's looking for the Messiah, the promised Messiah of Daniel, and you've had 700 years of this domination. What would that make you feel like? Because you've got different groups in the New Testament that are going to react to this domination differently. And that's going to cause them to have different beliefs and to react differently to Christ himself. Nebuchadnezzar is back up here in the Babylonians, right?
I thought the Jews were under domination for like 70 years, and then they came back and rebuilt Jerusalem.
No, they did. They came back. So they were brought into Babylonian captivity. They were in the captivity for 70 years. But during that 70 years, the Medo-Persians conquered Babylon. And so all of Babylon's territory became now the territory of the Medes and Persians. And remember, the Jews were only allowed to go back because of Cyrus's decree, right? So, but they weren't free. Like that land wasn't theirs to rule. They ruled with any authority that was given to them by the Medo-Persians, right? Darius, right? Cyrus, things like that. So they were never their own, they did not rule themselves. It was only during the Maccabean period coming up where they have about 80 years of sort of self-rule where the land is theirs again. And then it gets ripped apart from them again. So you basically have 700 years where they are dominated by other forces, okay? So put yourself in that, imagine yourself as an American being under domination of multiple world powers and never being able to have any self-rule. Well, you lose more than that. All right. So we had the Medo-Persians that come in, and they, again, now all the 12 tribes are underneath this Medo-Persian Empire. And then in 330 BC, of course, we have Alexander the Great. Now, before 330, the Medes and Persians are starting to lose their grip. They lose some pretty significant battles against the Greeks. And then finally in 330, Alexander the Great he breaks through and he takes over the entire world, right? In lightning speed, like blitzkrieg, type of speed here. So he takes over the world. And of course, the part that he takes over the world includes the land of Israel, right? So he takes over Israel and makes it part of the Greek Empire. And then he dies at a very, very young age, right? And in 323 BC, when he dies, his kingdom, he doesn't have an heir. He doesn't have an heir appointed. So what happens is his 4 top generals, the land in his kingdom is divided between those 4 generals, right? And you have these different kind of areas within the land that it's divided. Now, 2 of those generals, Ptolemy and Seleucid, the Seleucid Empire are the ones that are important for us. The other 2 parts of the empire that get broken off don't really impact the New Testament history very much. But as you can see from this slide, this purple area down here, this is Ptolemy. This is one of his generals, and he gets the area kind of Egypt. And then you've got the Seleucids up here in the gray. And then what's going to happen is that over history, you're going to see this back and forth, right? Even the New Testament, or not New Testament, the Old Testament even talks about what this battle looks like between these 2 Greek empires, because now they become enemies instead of being a united Greek empire. So Alexander the Great's empire is divided up between these 4 generals. And for a while, Israel was under the control of the Ptolemies of Egypt, which is kind of odd. You think about it, because Israel was enslaved to Egypt in Egypt, and now they're back enslaved to Egypt in their own land, right? So it's this is twice now where Egypt is sort of not a good thing for the Jewish people. However, one of the good things about the Ptolemies is, even though they were Greek, and even though they evangelized the Greek philosophies and ways of living, they actually let the Jews practice their religion. They're like, look, if you want to worship our Greek gods, fine. If you want to worship this guy called, Yahweh, whatever, go ahead, do it, right? So they pretty much allowed them the religious freedom to do what they needed to do, which, of course, as a Jew, that's the one thing that you want, right? The worship of Yahweh. So that was fine, but then again, there's this back and forth struggle between these 2 Greek empires, Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And what happens is in 198, the Seleucids finally dominate, and they come to dominate the areas of the Ptolemies, which means that they bring under their control the land of Israel. Now, here's the difference. Yeah, they're Greeks as well, and they want to proselytize, and they want to make people, introduce people to the Greek culture and make everything Greek. But their big difference is they wanted you to convert to Greek religion. So they outlaw the worship of Yahweh. And they make it so that if you're a Jew, you need to now practice Greek religion. Well, now that's the one thing that the Jews can't do, right? Because what was the main reason for them going into Babylonian exile? The one thing that God says over and over again. No other gods. No other gods. They committed idolatry. The number one reason they went into Babylon captivity is their idolatry. And so now they're being forced to adopt idolatry again. And they realize, look, it's either God or these other people. We're going to choose God this time because we know what that gets us the other route. So what happens is that one of the rulers, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, from the Greek from the Seleucid Empire, in 168 BC, he marches in and he kills Jason, who's the last of the Zadokite high priest, the line of the Zadokites, the high priest from the Old Testament. He kills him, and then he desecrates the temple by erecting a statue of Zeus and then offering a pig on the altar as in a form of worship to Zeus. This is the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, so now all of a sudden, what the Jews are going to think. Like, this is not okay, right? This is bad. So he's desecrating the temple, offers a pig there, erects this image of Zeus there. And then what he does is he then starts to command and demand that the Jewish priest now engage in temple worship to Zeus in the temple. So he's going to force them to offer sacrifices to Zeus. Well, there's a gentleman in 167 called Mattathias the Hasmonean. He's a priest. He's a godly priest. And he says, there is no way we are going to do that, right? And so there's a Greek official that comes to the temple, and he's trying to force a Jewish priest to offer these illicit sacrifices. And Mattathias says, we're not going to do that. Well, the priest decides he's going to follow the Greek, because if I don't follow him, I'm going to get killed. And so the priest starts to try to prepare to offer these sacrifices. That ticks off Mattathias, who's the Jewish priest. So what does he do? He goes and kills him. He kills his fellow Jewish priest to prevent him from offering these illicit sacrifices on the altar. As soon as he does that, Mattathias and his 5 sons flee Jerusalem, and they start this rebel warfare, this revolution against the Syrians, right? They become later Syrians, the Greeks. These 5 sons end up becoming, in fact, the family becomes known as the Maccabees. Now, their last name is not Maccabee. It's not Judah Maccabee. It's not Simon Maccabee. It's not Mattathias Maccabee. They're Hasmoneans. But Maccabee was given to him as a moniker, as a title, because it means the hammer. And it was given to him to designate how they were able to conquer this massive, well-equipped, well-trained army by rebel warfare, right? And they just kept on hammering them until they were able to defeat them. And in 166, Mattathias, the father, dies and leaves his son Judah Maccabee, well-known, in charge of that. And of course, then we get in 165 BC, we get the cleansing of the temple. So on December 25th, the Maccabees go in and they cleanse and liberate the temple. They rededicate it to God. You've got this 8-day, and there's some mystical things about the fact that the oil never burnt out and whatever else. There's some things around that. That becomes known as, what's the celebration? Hanukkah. Hanukkah. So Hanukkah came before Christmas, just so you know. The Hanukkah wasn't the Jewish way of saying, hey, the Christians get lots of presents, so why don't we create it's not that thing. Hanukkah was before that. So we get this cleansing of the temple, and then we have going down, we've got the Maccabees continue to rebel until they finally are able to push these Greeks out of their country, and they have their own self-rule. And the last of them was Simon Maccabee. Now, the 5 Maccabee sons, they all die either in battle or treachery, assassination, but they all end up dying. And what you have here then is you have this last Simon Maccabee. Since he's a Hasmonean, he starts what's called the Hasmonean dynasty. You ever heard of that, the Hasmonean dynasty? Okay, no one? All right. The Hasmonean dynasty or kingdom was the descendants of Simon Maccabee. So now, at this point in time, the Jewish people actually have control of their country again. They pushed the Greeks out. They control their own destiny at this point. And then from Simon, you've got John Hyrcanus I, and then you've got Aristobulus I, Alexander Yanai or Janaeus, and then you've got Salome Alexandria, which was the wife of Alexander. Okay, now when she dies, so she's now the ruler. She's the queen. She's the ruler of Israel. They are self-ruling at this point. Again, they've got about an 80-year period of self-rule. The problem is, just like Alexander the Great, she does not appropriately name her successor, right? So she's got 2 sons. One of them is Hyrcanus II, and one of them is Aristobulus V, right? And they start waging war on each other because they both think that they're the one that should be ruling over the Hasmonean kingdom, right? So you got these 2 Jewish brothers, and then they're the people that support them behind them. And this battle kind of goes on. And what happens is that they reach out to Rome to help solve the problem. Okay? So if you ever wonder how Rome got involved in the land of Israel, they didn't do it through military conquest. They were invited in by these fighting Jewish people, the clans fighting against each other to help solve the problem. Hey, Rome, come in and support me. Bring your armies with you. and then get rid of these guys over here, right? That's essentially what's going on between these two brothers and their clans.
Alexandria, who was Jewish?
Yeah, these are all Jews. Yeah, these are all Jews. And again, the Jews are now the Hasmonean dynasty are all Jews, and they are self-ruling as Jewish people over the land of Israel. But Rome says, oh, sure, you want us to come, you want us to bring our army too? Well, we can help, we can do that. And they bring their army in, and guess what Rome never does? They don't leave. So you invite the devil to come in, and then you have to live with the devil, right? This is the bed that you've now made. So now Rome comes in, and they haven't had to conquer you. You invited them in, but now they have their armies there. So now you've got Rome that now controls the land of Israel, okay? And in 47 BC, then you've got Julius Caesar, who's the last of the, he's the last of the Roman Republic before Augustus or Octavius becomes Caesar Augustus, right, in the new empire. So you go from a republic to an empire with Caesar Augustus. But Julius Caesar, the last Roman emperor, appoints Antipater, okay, who is an Idumean. Now, what nationality is an Idumean? They're an Edomite. Edom, that's Idumean is just is the Greek form of the word, the Hebrew word for Edom. So Julius Caesar appoints this Edomite, Antipater, to be governor over Judea, and his son, Herod the Great, to be ruler over Galilee. So Herod the Great now gets put into power in this small area, well, not small, but this area of Galilee, while his father has the rulership over Israel, appointed by Julius Caesar. Then we've got another war that comes in, Hyrcanus, we're not done with this whole thing, we still think we're the right ones. So you got this war that goes on. Herod the Great escapes to Rome, right? And Rome says, we will support you, Herod the Great. And they send their armies with him to get rid of these rebels, these Parthians, and to get rid of that. And when they do that, then they install Herod the Great as ruler over the land of Israel. Now, Herod the Great is what nationality? He's an Edomite. Remember, he's an Edomite. His dad was an Edomite, and Herod the Great. So Herod the Great's not a Jew, but he rules over the Jewish people. One of the reasons why they didn't like him, first of all, he was just nasty and vicious. But the second reason they didn't like him because he wasn't a Jew. He was a nominal convert to Judaism, but he was not a Jew. He converted nominally to the Jewish religion, more for the sake of peace in the area than for any other reason. So now you have Herod the Great reconquering Israel under the authority of Rome. Now Rome now has Israel significantly under their thumb. Okay, picture clear so far of how this has sort of gone? Yes.
Is there going to be a test tonight?
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Yes. But I want you to get this, because when you start meeting Herod the Great and Herod Antipas and Herod Agrippa, like we meet him in the New Testament accounts in Acts, these are all descendants of Herod the Great, installed by Rome. They're not Jews. Herod Agrippa was part Jew, but not fully Jew. All right. This, I'm not going to go through this. I just have this here in case any of you want to really, like history buffs and you love it. These are the Roman emperors then that we have during the New Testament period. So Octavius, and then all the way down to Vespasian. And then you got these Roman prefects, or kind of local governors that you have, local rulers. And the ones that are in bold, like Pontius Pilate, Herod Agrippa. Remember Herod Agrippa? He's a part Jew because he's a descendant of Mariamne, who was a Jew, and so he's kind of half Jewish, which the Jewish people like that a little bit more than Herod the Great. But he's also one that killed the Apostle James. So before we get too cozy with Herod Agrippa, remember that he killed the apostle. And then we have Antonius Felix and Porcius Festus. So we get Felix and Festus in the book of Acts, right? So this is kind of the players that we have coming out of this Antipater Herod the Great dynasty that ended up ruling and reigning over Israel during that New Testament time period, and have such a tremendous impact on that. Okay, any questions?
Great. It's awesome.
Well, I think there'll be a test, and like you said, there'll be a test. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I do want you to start to see, because we meet these characters in the New Testament. Like, who are these people? And perhaps why don't they like Christ, which is really when we start getting into the actual gospel accounts, we're going to see these run-ins sometimes with people. What we have here is we have Antipater and Antipater the first and Antipater the second. So Antipater the second is the one that was set to rule over Israel, and of course his son Herod the Great. Antipater the second, really rich family, right? Very affluent. He was an Edomite, right? He did convert to Judaism in a nominal way. He's not a Jew, but he did keep their kosher laws, right? The one thing that Jews were really specific about is their kosher laws, right? He didn't keep much else as far as the Jewish laws, but he did keep that. And he did also forbid that the women in his family marry uncircumcised men. So there are in some ways in which he tried to keep the peace. Because the one thing as a ruler over Israel that you didn't want to happen, if you didn't want to get in the bad graces of Rome, was what? Rebellion, right? So Rome, what they wanted, they said, hey, look, as long as we get our taxes and as long as everybody is all nice and playing fair, it's fine. So you're Herod the Great, your job is to make sure that everything's all peaceful. So don't tick them off. You know, you rule kind of with an iron fist if you need to, but don't tick them off unnecessarily, right? So you even see that when we get to Pontius Pilate. And you ever wonder, like, well, why? He knows he's not guilty. He knows Christ isn't guilty. Why would he do that? Well, he knows that he's going to have a complete revolution and rebellion on his hands. And guess what? Rome doesn't look kindly to that. You'll be either, kicked out someplace, banished someplace, or you'll be dead. So Pilate's just like, look, I'm saving my own skin here, right? And this is kind of what's going on. So Antipater is a convert to Judaism. He was very highly influenced by the Greeks, and so his family, including Herod the Great and onward, were taught in Greek philosophy. One of the interesting things that really ticked the Jewish people off, particularly the priest, the godly priest, and of course the Pharisees as well, is the fact that he was supportive of the Olympic Games. And he actually allowed and had some of the priests participate in the Olympic Games. Now, the Olympic Games are performed in what? What kind of clothes you're wearing? Not very low. You're nude. You're in the nude. The Olympic Games are performed in the nude. So now you've got these priests of God performing in the Olympics in the nude. Well, that ticked off a lot of people, right? So we're going to see some like Pharisaic reactions against these types of things going forward. The other thing is that if you ever try to look at the tree, the family tree of Herod the Great and Antipater, you're going to need a PhD because this tree doesn't branch off very much, if you get my drift. Like, according to the Roman practices in the royalty and the ruling families, they married off to each other, close relatives. So if you ever try to figure out, like, yeah, it's my husband, but he's also my father and my brother, that's what you're going to get from Herod the Great's tree, if that makes any sense to you. Okay.
They wrote a song, I am my own grandpa.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, and this is just, I just wanted you to see this here. This is Herod the Great. He had 10 wives. These are the 5 wives that produced children that play a part in the New Testament. So again, Herod the Great, even though he only is, basically a few years of that he lived at the beginning of the New Testament period, his influence is throughout the entire New Testament, okay? I'm going to stop there for just a second. Ask if there's any questions or comments.
Who was King Herod at the time looking for baby Jesus?
That's Herod the Great.
That is Herod the Great.
Yes.
And so who cut off John's head?
That's not Herod the Great. That's his son.
Herod Antipas?
Yeah, Antipas. Yeah, and his brother, it was his brother Herod Philip that it was his wife that was, yes, I'll keep this PG, but yes, you know what I'm talking about. It's this. And so, yeah.
His wife's daughter.
Well, the wife was the one that wanted his head cut off, and the daughter was dancing, and he said, I'll give you half of my kingdom. And she went to her mom, and her mom said, I want his head. And so she says, hey, give me his head. And they cut off the John the Baptist's head. But yeah, so Herod the Great dies very early in the gospel accounts. Yes, Rich.
So these Edomites?
Edomites, they're from Edom, yep.
Edomites, and other people that dominated Israel, are these the people that God told Israel to destroy at one point earlier? I mean, are these people have historical relationships with Israel or no?
Some do. The Edomites certainly do. I mean, the Edomites are blood relatives, right? The Edomites are they're blood relatives. And they were the ones that refused passage when Israel was coming out of the Exodus, refused to give them the water and refused passage. And so God pronounces judgment upon the Edomites. In fact, it's said of the Edomites that their destruction, the smoke of their destruction will rise forever and ever. That's what it says about Edom. They will be completely wiped out without any chance of returning. The smoke of their destruction will rise forever and ever. That's what God says about the Edomites. The Romans and the Greeks and the Medes and Persians, not so much, because that's different parts of the world. But certainly the Edomites had a connection in the Old Testament to them. Yeah.
They came from what? Yes, the Edomites.
The Edomites were no, that was from Esau. It's Esau. The Moabites came from Lot.
Moabites,
Yeah.
Moabites.
From Lot, and from Esau came the Edomites. So they're blood relatives, and that's why God's so harsh on them, because he says, look, these are your blood brothers, and yet you won't let them go, and you make them march all the way around the desert when they need water and passage. Okay, so let's just go through a little bit of Herod the Great. I want you to understand a little bit about who he is, because if you ever, like where me and I was reading the account of, him trying to kill the babies and stuff, I always scratched my head and I thought, I know it's in the Bible. I guess I know it's true, but that just doesn't seem right. Like, who would ever put up with a king going out and killing babies? I mean, you ever kind of have that reaction, like, I know it's true, but it just doesn't feel right. Well, when you know who Herod the Great was, that sounds exactly like the thing he does. And it's just one of the many things that he did that was absolutely just crazy and nuts. So I want you to sort of understand who he was. Again, installed by Rome in 37 BC as a king, ally, and friend. This was a special title and designation for him. He was what was called a client king. So the client kings were people that were loyal to Rome. They were local to the area. And their job was, of course, to control that local area and to make sure that Rome got its taxes, to make sure that if Rome needed military men, that they would be able to supply that. They were also responsible for fortifying and taking care of their borders, right? So, they had to sort of protect their own area with, Roman help with that as well. And one of the benefits of being this king and ally and friend was that you got to be granted Roman citizenship, and you could possibly be a senator. So, Herod the Great, man, that's in his wheelhouse. That's exactly what he wants, right? Now, the interesting thing is that he can't transfer his kingship to his son. That was all controlled by Rome, right? So Rome was the one that appointed the next successor. They said none of this tomfoolery about people kind of trying to figure out who the next king is. We're just going to tell you who the next king is, right? None of these other battles and wars and assassinations. We're going to try to tell you who this is. Now, interesting enough, not only did Rome reserve the right to appoint the next king, but Rome also reserved the right to appoint the high priest. So what you're going to find out is that Rome appoints a high priest, and they're not the right high priest, by the way. They don't come from the right stock, right? And so that tends to tick off the Pharisees quite a bit, because you've got these high priests that Rome appointed. Well, Rome doesn't care what God's requirement is for the high priest, but Rome appoints them, and we'll kind of figure out why that is in a little bit here. Herod, very wealthy. In fact, what we can tell is that even as a client king, that he had a special relationship with Rome. And from what we can tell from history, that Rome probably allowed him to not have to pay taxes, or very minimal taxes. So he was able to amass this great, incredible wealth, which allowed him to do these building projects. Like, he wanted to make sure that his legacy was going to be there. And so He was involved in lots of these, community projects, architectural projects, things like that. The biggest one that he had, of course, was the building of the temple. That's why it's called Herod's Temple. Remember, you have Solomon's temple that gets destroyed in the Babylonian captivity. You have the returnees that come back from Babylonian captivity and they rebuild this temple. But the Old Testament says that the people that saw the old temple and saw the new one were just crying because they couldn't believe how horrible the new temple was. Not very good. So Herod comes along and he takes that thing and he makes that thing shine. Absolutely shine. And the Jews did love him for that. They didn't like him for a lot of stuff, but they did love the fact that he actually built a temple. All right. He also did make Israel really secure. He had a lot of these different towns he set up that really fortified Israel, which will come into play, not necessarily the New Testament, but when the Jews revolt against the Romans in 70 AD. Herod's actually built up some pretty cool defenses there that make it kind of difficult for the Romans to sort of work on or get the people out that are rebelling. But one of the things about Herod was he was super paranoid. Like this guy, he was paranoid about everything. And in fact, he always thought that there was someone that was trying to take his throne, right? So he ends up killing his favorite wife, not just a wife, but his very favorite one, because he thinks that she's trying to take the throne from him. So Mariamne. He also kills 3 of his sons, right? Because he thinks that, again, they're trying to get come after his throne. So this is a guy that doesn't mind killing his family members, including his favorite family members, right? Now, that will help explain when you think about Matthew chapter 2, the boys that are under 2 ages. If he's willing to kill his own family members because he thinks that they're going to be a threat to his throne, he has no problem with killing 2-year-old kids who he thinks are also going to be a threat to his throne. Above all else, he wanted to make sure that he was king. Again, Herod's temple, the rabbis and the Jewish people didn't like him for much, but they did say, and this is a quote from the rabbinic literature, which again, I'll try to bring this stuff in throughout the course as we can. It used to be said, he who has not seen the temple of Herod has not seen a beautiful building. It was, you could see it from miles and miles away. This thing would gleam and glitter. It was absolutely beautiful. Now, his viciousness, like I said, he kills his own family members. And Caesar once said that it's better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. And the reason for that is because as a nominal convert to Judaism, Herod didn't eat what? Pork. So Caesar said, hey, look, Herod, he doesn't eat pig. So if you're Herod's pig, you're okay. He ain't going to eat you. But if you're his son, watch out, right? This is his viciousness that he had. As he was getting towards the end of his life and he knew that he was going to die, he knew that people were not going to mourn him because he, again, incredibly vicious, not well liked at all. People didn't care for Herod the Great, but he wanted to make sure that people would mourn his death. So what he does is he goes and he gets these high-ranking citizens, these wealthy people, these well-known people from all the different cities. He brings them to the Hippodrome. He puts them in there, and then he gives the command that upon my death, kill them all. And then let everybody know that they've died so that when I die, all Israel will mourn. Now, they may not be mourning for me, but they're going to cry. So if they're not going to cry for me, Israel's going to cry. This is the type of thing that he did. And of course, his sister Salome rightly understood, like, look, this is a dumb idea. And she disobeyed his orders and they were never killed and they were released. But that's the type of person that Herod the Great was, this incredible viciousness. After his death, Herod's kingdom is divided into these 3 areas: Judah and Samaria, which is under Archelaus. We've got Antipas, Galilee, and Perea, which we just talked about. And then, of course, Philip, which is in this northwest region, the Golan Heights area. Okay, that is... Yes. So this is the... we are now done with the Greek and the Roman and Medo-Persian background. I just want to stop there because now we're going to go to the Jewish background, which I think is even more applicable to what the New Testament. So just so you know, This is the only week we're going to do this type of stuff. We're going to be talking about a lot of data and facts. Next week, we're going to jump right into the gospel accounts, but this is important for you to understand the setup of this before we get there. What questions do you have about what we've covered before we go into the Jewish background? Yes.
When the king was killing the 2-year-old baby boys, was it even possible for them to grow up and become king in the age that he was already at?
I mean, the point is when you're not, no, because he was already on his, pretty close to his deathbed, right? And within a few years, he's actually going to be dead. But to someone who's crazy,
Right.
doesn't matter, especially when you've got these wise men, these Babylonian astrologers that come and say, we've seen the star, who the king of the Jews. And all of a sudden he's like, who is this? And he's already been born. How do you know? Well, I mean, we saw it 2 years ago. So it's not as if I can prevent him from being born. He's already here.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're crazy, you're crazy anyway. And the other thing too is it is possible that even though he's an infant at this point, 2 years old, that if it's recognized within the Jewish state that this is the king, it's possible that they would revolt and throw Herod out, right? I mean, that's entirely possible. We see that a few times in the Old Testament where that happens as well. So he has a semi-legitimate concern about this 2-year-old baby. I think it's obviously a little neurotic, but it wasn't beyond, I say reasonable that people could have said, oh, well, let's go find him and let's crown him king, even if he's only 2 years old and can't reign, right? You have a co-regent or you have someone that's sort of reigning in your place until you're old enough to make decisions. Yeah.
Well, how would Rome have felt about that?
Well,
I mean, if they revolted and overthrew,
they wouldn't. I mean,
Herod, are they gonna care or?
yeah, they would care.
As long as they get their tax or
Yeah,
their tax, I mean.
they would care. The thing is, the Jews were never going to do that.
Yeah.
He just is neurotic enough to think they're going to do that, right? So now we're going into Herod's paranoia. The Jews were never going to go probably do that, right? Now we do get into the gospel accounts where the Jewish people do try to forcibly make Jesus king. Remember that? And he resists that. And then you see some, there's some reactions and stuff. Well, why don't people want to do that? Well, there's some reasons why some people are not in favor of crowning Jesus as king, right? So, but anyway, that's more about Herod's paranoia than the Jews actually doing that and Rome responding, right?
Kings started their reign when they were actually youth.
Yeah, Josiah, 7. Yeah.
7 years old, so, rebellion could happen. Have you heard anything about what Caesar thought of this coup from Rome when Herod is paranoid and having all the young boys killed, Tacitus, Petronius?
Yep.
Josephus say anything about?
They do make some kind of offhand comments about Caesar's aware of this type of stuff. And as you can tell, he's not necessarily. So there's some indication that he realizes, hey, Herod is going to die. And if Herod dies, this could be messy because Herod's already the goofball anyway. So there's always some indication that he knew that there were some issues going on. I haven't read anything that says anything specifically about, what he said or did to take action, let's say to prevent when Herod died, the place to go into complete chaos, but they were definitely aware that this was a touchy situation, right? You've got this person that is a complete, control freak. He's already killed his family members and he's done these other types of things. We have to make sure that we kind of step in a little bit. There's some things that I've read about that, but nothing like direct that I can give you a quote on that.
They were so upset of having Rome concerned about rebellion, keep them in line, let them do what they want to do. And now, with the idea of all the baby boys being killed by this maniac who's in fear, I'm just wondering from that aspect only, Caesar could say, hey, don't ruffle anymore.
No. They definitely are. You can see that they're concerned about his stability, for sure. But I don't know of anything where they made plans to do anything about it. But the one thing you got to remember though is Bethlehem was not really a very big town. So, we think like if it would have been Jerusalem or Galilee, the towns in Galilee, I think the historians say the towns in Galilee are about 15,000 people a town. There's like 204 towns in Galilee. So that's a little bit of a different story there. Than Bethlehem was probably a little bit smaller type of town. So it may not have had as much publicity, let's say, as if he had done something in Galilee, Capernaum, or Cana. Yeah.
What's
Not
your
Cana,
take on
Capernaum.
this? There's a concerned citizen out there watching from afar. And she asked, if Rome appointed rulers, why was he so paranoid? If Rome was in charge, then it seems not just anyone could replace him without Rome's permission. So
True.
what was he all paranoid about?
Well, Rome has the right to do that, but what you see is that they tended to appoint someone from the family, right? So if you're Herod, you're thinking, well, look, if someone just assassinates me, they're probably going to appoint one of my sons. So, my sons, it's very easy. They're probably not going to appoint necessarily someone completely outside the family. And that's why you see all the way to Herod Agrippa in the New Testament in the Acts. So I'm assuming, again, we don't know this. I don't know this for sure, but I'm thinking that that's what Herod's thinking. Like, look, they'll just appoint one of my sons. So if one of my sons decides to do me in, it'll be easy for them to appoint somebody else. Now, the reality is Rome could have appointed somebody else, but when you're not thinking clearly and when you're paranoid, that kind of stuff doesn't necessarily matter. You're just looking at the other people that are next in line potentially, and you want to take care of who those people are. So thank you for the concerned citizen, Jennifer. Yeah. All right, so I'm trying to get through this because I really do want to make sure we start off in the Gospels next week. So let me try to see if I can get through as much of this as I can. Let's talk about some of these groups that you're going to meet now. Like, who are they? Who are these Pharisees? Who are these Sadducees? Well, the Pharisees were the dominant religious group at the time of Christ, right? They controlled the synagogues, right? The synagogue structure. They controlled the teaching, the religious teaching of the people, right? That's who these Pharisees were. It comes from the Hebrew word parush, which means separated. Because if you know the Pharisees, what they did is they said, we are separate from all these other sinners. And so when you see the Pharisees in the New Testament, what are they always doing? When Jesus is eating with publicans and sinners and prostitutes and things like that, what do they say? What's the reaction?
He's evil and the devil.
How dare you eat with these people? Why? Because to them, they were the righteous ones. They were separated from the evil and those people who were the uncouth, those people who didn't follow God's laws. We're the ones that follow God's laws. We're the one that upholds God's laws. We're the ones that are the righteous, holy ones. So we are separated. That's where the word comes from. And you see that arrogant attitude that they have throughout all the New Testament, right? They're active until about the end of the first century. And then basically what happens is that after the destruction of 70 AD, that the Pharisees sort of turn into this group that we call Rabbinic Judaism. And today, that's what it is, Rabbinic Judaism. So for 2,000 years, they're kind of initiated this rabbinic structure that you see even today. Now, their biggest sort of thing that impacts the New Testament and their relationship to Christ is that they were responsible for the creation of what was called the oral law, right? Now, Moses gave the written law to Israel on Mount Sinai, right? That's what we have in the Old Testament, right? It's the Mosaic covenant, right? He gave them the Mosaic law. Well, what the Pharisees said is that in addition to the written law that God gave, he also gave Moses all these oral laws, these thousands of them, not 613. The Mosaic commandment had 613 laws God gave. That's it, pretty small. That's what God gave in the written. But then they said, no. In addition to that, God also gave all these oral laws to Moses, these thousands and thousands of laws that God gave him, and that then these laws were transferred from Moses to the judges, to the priest, and onward, and it's all done orally. In fact, the oral law wasn't written down until 200 AD. In fact, you were not permitted to write it down; it had to be memorized, right? So they created this oral law, right? And they accuse Christ of breaking the law all the time, but the law that they are accusing him of breaking is not the Mosaic law. He doesn't break the Mosaic law. When they say you're breaking the law, they say you're breaking the oral law, which is their law. Now, according to their theology, that's also God's law. It just is that God gave it to Moses verbally. So they look at Christ and say, no, you're breaking God's law. Well, of course, Christ doesn't buy into that. Yes, Jeff.
Well, so the Pharisees, I know they believed in all of the Old Testament, like the Sadducees, right? And but where do they come up with the thousands of laws?
We're going to get into it.
Given orally, supposedly by God. I mean.
So I'm going to show you that.
How that came about?
Yep. Yeah, we're going to get to that here in just a second. So hold on to that question. Okay.
The episodes of the chosen, Jesus says, I am the law of Moses.
Yeah. And that got a lot of publicity as well. Anyway, we won't go there on that one. Now, here's the deal. When you read the rabbinic literature, what you realize is that the oral law is put on the same level as the Mosaic law. So from the Pharisees' perspective, their law was the same as God's law. It wasn't something subservient to it. It was on the same. If you broke their oral law, you broke God's law. And in fact, in some cases, the oral law is said to be higher than God's written law. And so the written law gets subjugated underneath the oral law. And I have a couple of quotes in some lessons down the road to show you that. So that's who these people were. They were in control of synagogues. They were religious leaders. They did believe, though, positively in the immortality of the soul, the existence of angels, right? They did believe that there was freedom of the will and also the resurrection of the dead. Now, if you know the Old Testament, there's only a couple verses in the Old Testament that really say anything about the resurrection of the dead. So if you read the Old Testament, you're not going to strongly get that, which is why the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They said, look, I don't know, I read the Old Testament, I don't see it at all. When you die, right? So we'll get to them in a second. For that. So the reason, though, why the Pharisees and Jesus clashed is what? What is the reason? Well, they were hypocrites, but that's not the reason why they clashed. They clashed because
Keep their authority and leadership.
That's right. So Jesus is always challenging them. In fact, not only does Jesus break their law, he actually goes out of his way to break their law. In fact, he sometimes goes out of his way to tick them off, to create a circumstance of conflict intentionally. Like Jesus isn't just stumbling around there he's like, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to wash my hands before I ate. No. He knows exactly what he's doing when he breaks their law. And it was because he said, look, your law is not God's law, and we're not subservient to it. You put a heavy yoke on the people. My yoke is light. The law of God was light compared to the yoke that was put onto them. And this constant conflict where Jesus is saying, you're wrong. And he's telling all the people that don't be like the Pharisees. He calls them out, calls them nasty names. They don't like that. He is challenging their authority and their rule, and they believe they're honestly protecting God and his laws. And so this is a heretic. Jesus is a heretic that has to be silenced, right?
That must
Yes.
have been God's will that he did that,
It was
because he had to them off enough
to die.
that they would want to kill him.
Yeah. All of these groups here, he's going to tick off, and they're all going to want him dead for different reasons. So when I said that God in his fullness, even Jesus in his interactions, creates situations that for every one of these groups we're going to talk about, he makes them angry. And they all want to kill him. And so there isn't anybody on his side, right? They're all against him. Well, how do you get people against him when he's done all these marvelous miracles? Look what Jesus did. Who wouldn't like Jesus? The nice guy, he's healing people. I mean, gives us bread, whatever else. Well, it's because you get these people that get ticked off, and all of a sudden they have enough power and control where they ends up in his crucifixion. All right.
Exactly. I'm going to heal that.
That's right. Yeah. No, you are right. There are times when, like I said, he will intentionally do something because he knows he's going to break their law and they're going to call him on the carpet. And he's creating conflict. So when people think of Jesus as this nice little, I don't know, like hippie that just goes around, I don't know, smoking pot and doing whatever, listening to music, I don't know what they, this idea of Jesus, like he's just this person that's loving and caring and whatever else. He was not afraid of conflict or of causing conflict for the right things. Right? He says, the zeal for my house will consume me, right? When he goes in the temple and he cleans it out. And of course, the disciples remember, oh gosh, zeal for his house will consume him. Well, that's what he's talking about. Like he was not a pansy. He was not a, this whole type of thing. He was not afraid of conflict. Anyway, if we're going to get any place, I'm going to have to keep on talking here. Scribes, you hear a lot about scribes. Well, who in the world are these scribes, right? Well, the scribes, they're the only group that you're going to find back in the Old Testament. But in the Old Testament, they have a radically different role than they do in the New Testament. It's almost unrecognizable. In the Old Testament, the scribes were usually public officials. Like for the king, they were the ones that were literate enough to be able to write down contracts, to be able to do things like commercial stuff of transactions, this amount of, barrels of wheat for this, whatever else. They were these people that were able to do all that. They were the literate. So they were scribes and wrote that down. They were also responsible for the scriptures and making sure that they were copying stuff correctly, right? What you get though in the New Testament is that they have changed radically. So Ezra was a scribe, right? And Ezra realized that the reason why the Jews went into Babylon in captivity was because they had committed idolatry. And Hosea says the people perish, the Jewish people perish because of their lack of knowledge. So what does Ezra and his group of scribes attempt to do? Teach. They take God's word, and you even see this in the rebuilding of the temple and everything else. You see Ezra and the scribes, they're actually communicating out to the group. They've got, here, and then these people communicate it out. They're communicating. They're basically doing what pastor does, what your pastor does. Taking God's word and then expounding it to the people to teach them. So it starts out really, really great. It ends up really badly because what these scribes end up being mostly Pharisees. And they're not just Pharisees, though, because Pharisees were required to have memorized the Torah, right? First 5 books of the Bible. The scribes had to memorize not only that, they had to memorize all the oral law as well. These were your lawyers. These were the people that knew whether or not you stepped an inch too far or picked up 1 grain too much. I mean, that's who these people were. And so if anyone wanted to know whether or not someone had broken God's law, this oral law, the scribes are the ones that did it. So they're like the Pharisee of the Pharisees, right?
That start, it didn't start with Ezra.
No, but it progresses on, and I promise you, hold on that question. I got 3 or 4 slides that are devoted just to your question. So I promise I'll get to it.
And Randall, the oral law was given at the same time.
No. That's what the Pharisees said. So in order to if you're going to justify, look, if you look in the Old Testament, you say, well, I mean, God gave the 613 commandments. I don't see the oral law. I mean, you tell me, that you can't do X, Y, Z. I don't see that in the Old Testament. So how do you justify a law that isn't just a man-made law? You have to justify and say, well, no, God gave us this law. Well, if you can't find that law in the Old Testament anywhere, what do you have to do? You've got to justify by saying, no, God gave it. He just gave it verbally. The reason why you don't see it written down is because God didn't want it written down. He wanted it to be oral translation or transmission. That was their logic behind it.
It's their logic, but it's also their trickery, their fakery.
It's really, so a negative is hard to prove. Like, God didn't give you this thing verbally. Well, how do you know that? Well, were you on the mountain with him? How do you know he didn't give it to you? I mean, you start getting into those things, and that's sort of what it is that no, these are God's laws. So no, God did not give the oral law. That's what the Pharisees said to justify their laws. All right. And we'll get, I promise, Jeff, I promise we're going to get there. So the Zealots, okay, the Zealots were really on the Pharisaic movement. They're like the right, if we want to talk in terms today, they're the right wing. Like they are the ultimate, like conservative, we are not going to put up with Rome, right? They hated Roman domination. In fact, they started a movement that Josephus calls the fourth philosophy, right? Against Roman domination, okay? And in fact, their hatreds towards Rome, they're really responsible for the bubbling up of this anti-Rome sentiment within the nation that eventually leads to the Jewish revolt in AD 66 and ends with the destruction 4 years later in AD 70, right? So these zealots play a lot of a part in the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, one of the 12 disciples was a zealot. Now, these zealots hated anybody who wanted to work with Rome. So if you were a tax collector, you were working for Rome. If you're a Roman guard or Roman citizen, whatever else, you're part of Rome. The interesting thing is that you've got one of Jesus's 12 disciples who is a zealot whose job is to kill anybody that they think is working to help Rome. Well, guess who else is on Jesus's team of the 12? Matthew. Okay, so you got two people here that from their public lives hate each other. And, you know, if Matthew turns his back the wrong way or goes down an alley a little bit, he may not walk out, like, right? So you've got Simon the Zealot here. That's part of this zealot group. And they carried these Sicarii, these little kind of knives around with them. And they would just go around and they would look for someone. It could be a Roman guard. It could be anybody. And they would just take it, jab them, kill them, and then, you know, zip on out. So it was like assassination is what this group was all about. Anyway, yes, these are Jews. They hated Rome. So in other words, you're going to find out there are Jews that are okay with Roman rule, and there are Jews that will at any cost try to get rid of Roman rule. These are on that side, right? They're all going to play a part in the gospel accounts, and they all play a part on Jesus's team of people, right?
The guy they let go at trial, they let him go. He was a zealot. What's his name?
You're talking Barabbas?
Barabbas.
Well, he was a zealot. He was a thief. Yeah. Anyway, the Sadducees. Who are these Sadducees? All right. So you've got these two groups, and it can be a little bit confusing. Well, now the Sadducees, they are these rich, aristocratic, priestly tribe. Most of them come from the priestly tribe. And a lot of them are connected with the Hasmonean dynasty. So what you have here is you have the Pharisees who are with the people. They tend to not, you know, they are many times against wealth and that kind of stuff. So you get this kind of end of the spectrum over here. And then you get these people. These are the elite. These are the rich, the wealthy, and the powerful. And guess what? They control the temple because they're the priest. Okay? So what we find out with Christ, and we're going to talk about this in a little ways down the road, is that they were using the temple to line their own pockets, which is one of the reasons why Jesus was so against them. It's also the reason why they wanted to kill him, right? Because Jesus twice goes in and cleanses the temple. That's the means for them to continue making their wealth and money. So they can't stand him because he keeps coming in and trying to ruin their business. These are rich people. You're taking all my money. I forgot to tell you the reason why the zealots don't like Christ is because he doesn't act like someone who's going to kick out Rome. They would like that. And a couple of times they want to make him king. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it. So if you're a zealot, you're thinking, man, this guy's a hindrance to us, right? You're talking peace and whatever else. That's not what we want. We don't want peace. We want war, right? So you got the zealots have an issue with him. But you got these Sadducees. Now, they end up fading from history because they're a priest. And in 70 AD, the temple is destroyed, never been rebuilt. So there's no need for the priest anymore. There's no temple for them. And so the Sadducees just go poof. But during the time of Christ, they were extremely powerful, okay? They only accepted the written law and rejected the oral law. So there's some parts of these groups where you look at it and go, gosh, you know, I align with that one. These guys are all about just sticking with the Old Testament. They're against these Pharisees who can have all these laws, but then again, they're immoral, They are nothing but, money grubbers for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, they were just these wealthy elite people that wanted to keep and control their power, right? So that's who we have as the Sadducees, and they play a big part. Now, Samaritans. The Samaritans, if you remember correctly, in the Babylonian, sorry, not the Babylonian, the Assyrians, the Assyrian captivity, the Assyrians came in, and in the northern kingdom, they took out the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom. They left some people there, but then what they did is they did this policy of bringing in outsiders into the land to intermarry, right? Because if you intermarry with these people, it's harder for those people to revolt, because now all of a sudden you're fighting against your own people. Like you bring someone in, you marry, you have kids, and all of a sudden the kid's like, well, where's my allegiance to? My mom's a Jew, my dad's, I don't know, an Assyrian or something like that. So they brought these people in to mix in with them, and they became known as the Samaritans. And the Samaritans were not only ethnically diverse, they were no longer Jews, they were mixed, but they were also religiously diverse, right? The Samaritans only believed in the 5 books of Moses. They didn't believe in the rest of the Old Testament. So don't bother talking to them about Daniel, or don't talk to them about, Psalms or Proverbs or whatever else. They just held to the 5 books, right? They also, when the Jews came back from Babylonian captivity, and they were allowed, from the Medo-Persians, they were allowed to rebuild the temple. They go back to Jerusalem, and these Samaritans now that have been living there for quite a while, they come down to the Jews and they say, hey, can we help you rebuild the temple? Remember that? And the Jews say, not on your life. You're not Jews, and you're religiously syncretistic. You have no part in rebuilding the temple. And so they said no to him. And so the Samaritans said, fine, whatever, we don't need you. And then all of a sudden, that's where this rift now that starts for about 400 years. So by the time of Christ, this little war between them, where this disagreement has festered for a long time. Now, what they did is the Samaritans said, well, if you won't allow us to build the temple here, we're going to build our own temple on Mount Gerizim. That's the real temple. So they went and built this temple on Mount Gerizim in Samaria. And what they did is they went back through the Old Testament, and anytime it talked about Jerusalem or Mount Moriah, they would replace that with Mount Gerizim, because they needed a justification for why the temple on Mount Gerizim was God's temple and not the one in Jerusalem. So you get this conversation in John 4 between him and the Samaritan woman, and she's talking about Mount Gerizim, which is where we worship. And he says, no, you're wrong. It's actually the one in Jerusalem, by the way. That's the conflict going on here. If you won't let us build our temple, we'll build our own, and then we'll rewrite the parts of the Old Testament that say you're right, and we'll put ours in there, and that justifies our religious beliefs, okay? And there are actually Samaritans that still live there today. All right, I've got a few more to go through, and
That's just 700 Samaritans in
Yeah.
Israel today.
Yeah.
That's strange to me.
yeah, in fact, you can even go visit the sites and stuff that they've got there. Yeah. All right, yes, Mike.
We're studying Nehemiah right now. Does that have anything to do with this? Because in Nehemiah, when they were rebuilding the gates and the walls, there were the guys that Nehemiah says, you guys don't have anything to do with this at the end. And is that part of the Samaritans?
That's not Nehemiah. Nehemiah was rebuilding the wall, right? So what's that? What? Oh, yeah, he was rebuilding the walls. We were building of the temple when they weren't allowed to do that. And I see, I thought I had a mistake there. Okay. I do have one. Did not oppose Romans, Texas. I don't have any idea what, taxes. Yeah, the Romans, Texas, this is sort of, that's definitely wrong. So please, that should say taxes and not Texas. I apologize. It should be apostrophe there. All right. The Herodians. Who were the Herodians? The Herodians were on the opposite end of the Zealots. The Zealots hated Roman rule and would do anything to get rid of it. The Herodians were Jews. They would say, well, we don't really love the Romans, but we're okay if the rule of Rome comes through the house of Herod. We're okay with that. Because it provides stability, right? We want there to be stability in the land. And so they wanted to kind of do everything to make sure that the Romans didn't get too ticked off. So that's fine. As long as it's through the house of Herod, we will support that. So what you have here then is you have the Zealots and the Herodians on opposite ends of this. Like, how can you support them? Well, you know, and they did. And of course, they were okay with paying Roman taxes. The Zealots were not. The Zealots actually believed that paying taxes to Rome meant that you were making the Roman emperor God, and therefore Yahweh wasn't God. So paying taxes, and of course you have these tax issues in the Gospels. And you're like, well, what's going on here? Well, who are the groups that are asking the question, and what are they trying to do? They're trying to get Jesus into a bind where if he answers one way, you're going to tick off one group. If he answers another way, you're going to tick off another group. And of course, Jesus being the wisest person that ever lives, he takes a third route and completely destroys the argument. But you have these Herodians that were also okay with Roman rule through the house of through Herod's dynasty.
So the Sadducees were Jewish?
Yes,
And the Herodians were
Jewish.
Jewish.
Yeah, again, they were just ones that said we're okay with Rome ruling as long as it comes through the house of Herod. That's why they're called Herodians, right? House of Herod. Okay, a few other elements before we just end up tonight. We're getting very close to being able to just jump right in the Gospels here, but hopefully this is helpful for you to understand these groups. The second temple, right? Zerubbabel, I forget Mike or someone was asking the questions. It's Zerubbabel that said, no, you can't do. So was rebuilt by him after the Jews returned from Babylonian exile. We already talked about Herod the Great refurbishing that. We also have the priesthood, and I already mentioned this, so I'll just kind of go over this right here. The priesthood, according to Exodus 29:9, was to be inherited through Aaron, right? You had to be a Levite through Aaron. Well,
Who was the brother of Moses?
yes, and what you have is you have Rome saying, no, we're going to appoint the high priest. So you get the high priest being appointed by Rome instead of being through the line of Aaron. So, well, if you're a Pharisee, guess what you're going to think? Not on our watch. They can't stand the Sadducees. That's one of the reasons why. It's like, look, you're not even the proper people. I mean, it's kind of like if you have a church and someone takes someone who's an atheist and says, you're the pastor of the church. You'd be like, that person has no right to be a pastor of the church. They don't even believe in God. I mean, that's sort of the feeling that you get here with these people. Like, these people aren't even the right people. How dare they take on this role of the high priest? And then how dare do they charge us all this money, make all this money off of us, not in the right people? So you can see this animosity between the people groups around that time. And of course, Christ has to deal with that. Okay. Fantastic. I'll end here with this. The temple police, you occasionally will hear about the temple police in the gospel accounts. The term you're going to find it's called the captains of the temple. And the reason why they needed this is that according to the Mosaic law, the Gentiles were only allowed in the court of the Gentiles, right? They couldn't come in to where the Jews were allowed to go. So the Roman guards and Roman citizens, not the non-Jews, weren't allowed to go in there. So now you don't really have a police force inside of the temple. So what they did is they created this, and it actually started back with King David, where you have this group of priests that are designed to protect the temple itself. So you had some priests that David commissioned that were there for the sacrifices, some priests that were there to sing songs and lead in worship, some priests that were there to take care of, like, mop the floors, like literally, like take out the trash, mop the floors, whatever else. And then you had other ones that were these priestly warriors designed to protect the temple. And that's what you have here are these temple police. And of course, they do play that role at the trial of Jesus. Okay.
Roman guards that couldn't go into the inner court under penalty of death. Who was going to?
Well, what you find out is that in parts of Jewish history when the Romans were there, they did put up, they did do things that were an incredible offense to the Jewish people, and it ended up in a revolt, and Rome was not happy. So, for instance, they had Roman shields that they put up on the walls of the temple. You don't do that. The Roman shields that had images and icons and things like that. So there was like a revolt, and Rome says, don't do that again. There's no reason to tick these people off by doing that kind of stuff. And so they would have, in that case, if the Roman soldiers were to come in, they would have died. Now, that doesn't mean that Rome would not have done anything to them, but they would have been under, I mean, they knew going into there would result in their death, right? That's how strict it was. All right. Finally, synagogues. Like, where did this whole synagogue thing start out with? Now, this is a problem because nobody knows really when the first synagogue was set up. Nobody really knows exactly how it came about. Now, the prevailing theory is that in the Babylonian captivity, the Jews did not have a temple, but they still needed a way to worship God and a way to teach each other. And so what they did is they would gather in these small communities, and they would read God's word, and they would worship and pray. Prayer became the substitute for sacrifice because they couldn't sacrifice, right? So how do you ask, how do you have an atonement for your sin when you can't sacrifice?
And by the way, during captivity, they were all intermarrying, and all of this stuff was going on during captivity, right? And this is happening.
Intermarrying amongst themselves, right? They didn't. When they came back to the land, that's what they got in trouble for, was when they came back to the land, right? And that's what Nehemiah gets all over them about. And we won't even go into the divorce issue and things like that, but that was an issue. But the point here that I'm trying to get across is that the prevailing idea, both in Jewish circles and Christian circles, is that that's where these synagogues developed, these small congregations of people that would meet, and they would meet then to be able to worship and pray and things like that. So what you have then is that these synagogues then started, and sometime during that Babylonian captivity or sometime during the 400 years, when you get to the time of Christ, there's synagogues all over the place. I think there's 120, I forget the number, synagogues in Jerusalem alone, right? A synagogue in every corner type of a thing, right? The interesting thing, if you were with me for the introduction of the Old Testament, until the synagogue happened, there wasn't really a corporate worship scenario in the Old Testament, right? You were required 3 times to come to the temple in Jerusalem for sacrifice for Passover, right? There's 3 required times, and then for any sacrifices you had to make, but you didn't come to the temple on Saturday and worship. You didn't do church or synagogue. This idea of this corporate worship didn't really start until the synagogue movement. So then by the time you have Christ that comes, all of a sudden you have the synagogue structure where there's idea of corporate worship, and it's happening every week, right? And that, of course, then sort of paves the way for this idea of Christians, when they would meet as a church, they're Jews, right? When Christianity started, they're all Jews. They're in a practice of meeting every single week to read the scriptures, to expound on the scriptures, to worship, and to pray. But you don't find that in the Old Testament. And if any of you are curious about that, let me know after we're done and I can go over that. But we find out sort of the first time there's this idea of this corporate worship that becomes really prominent within the life of the Jewish people. All right. Actually, I do have the number down here, 400 synagogues in the Talmud, right? And you're going to find Jesus taught regularly in the synagogues, right? Okay, and there's going to be quite a few instances where he does that and gets himself into trouble, so to speak.
Isn't that what Paul went to? Jews first.
Yeah, and Paul's always going that. In fact, Romans 1:16, right? I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Paul, even though Paul was the apostle to the Gentile, he always went to the Jews first, right? Anyway, that is where we're going to leave it for today. I do have a little bit more development, and this is where I promise you the next slides that we can cover next week, I promise those will answer your question about the development of the oral law and why it was so profound during the time of Christ and difficult to sort of deal with, but I'm going to leave it for here today and then just open it up for any questions, whether that's online or in person. Yes, Zip.
With regard to the activities going on in the temple, that's a daily sacrifice.
Mhm.
You mentioned the fact that there's no corporate worship in the temple, but what about for the four spring feasts and three feasts
Yep.
later on? That all occurred in the temple?
Yeah, so they were required to come for the three feasts, right? You got Passover, you got Tabernacles that they were required to come to. And they had the activities around that. But my point is that you didn't have a Sunday service. Like everyone didn't all come and then go to the temple and sing songs wherever else. Just wasn't like that. You had priests in your local area, and the Sabbath was actually intended to be a day of rest. In fact, you weren't allowed to walk more than a certain ways away from your house. So there's no way that you could have even gone to synagogue or church.
Well, in case any
Well, it is. I mean, if you're an Orthodox, yeah. So the idea of a weekly congregational get together for that purpose just wasn't in the Old Testament, except for certain feast times that they would come and do that. But when we get to the New Testament, all of a sudden we have this weekly meeting and going to the synagogue. But that's something that has happened from the Babylonian captivity onward, not something that you see present in the Old Testament in that way.
So the teaching, just to add on, the teaching that was given on Torah and all of that came in the Jewish schools for kids.
Yeah, they would train. Yeah, they would send their
That's where they got the focus there.
and in synagogue, and it depended if you're a boy or yeah.
Talking about prior to the captivity and all this, they had the religious school for the both boys and girls, but then the boys would go on up to school.
Yeah, I think that became more prominent towards more the New Testament time. If you're talking Old Testament, I think that becomes more prominent, that style. Like certainly in the New Testament, they had schools for them to go to. The girls were allowed to go to a certain age, boys a certain age. And if you were really smart, then you could also continue to go on. If not, you were just apprenticed to your father or somebody else. And kind of like the Amish view of education, I would say.
So we really don't have a feel for how the law was put into the minds of the Jewish people after the time of Moses.
Nope. I mean, we don't, the practical examples, not necessarily, but remember, God said that you are to, when you wake up, you are to talk to your children about it when you are walking by the way, and when you lay down. So the expectation and probably the reality for the most part was that was the more of the home structure that you would have is where that was communicated for sure. But you had Levites that would be around in your local area. Because remember when God gave the land of Israel, he apportioned out all the land except for the one tribe that didn't get an allotment of land was the tribe of Levi. And that's because the tribe of Levi was given these Levitical cities within all of the other tribes. And their role and responsibility was this local teaching and training. Now, how that happened, because the synagogue system didn't exist, the Bible didn't really give us a whole lot of concrete examples of how that practically happened. But that's how God set it up, is that these teachers of the law, these Levites that would also serve in the temple, right? David created the 24 orders of the Levites, so they would come on and off duty and come there, but they were also supposed to be positioned locally for that purpose. But yeah, it's when you read the Old Testament, you don't get a lot of how did they actually do this type of thing.
Were the Pharisees considered a rabbi?
Yeah, teachers. Yeah, rabbi just means teacher. Yeah, I mean, usually you'd have to go to a rabbinical school to attain a title of that, which is why sometimes they're a little bit. You didn't always have to, but that's the common route to do it. But you definitely, in the New Testament, one of the things that we'll go into is that what the rabbis taught is whenever you taught something, you always had to do it in the name of your mentor or the mentor's mentor, wherever you got it from. So the rabbinic way, in fact, even here today, I mean, you can go there, it'll be like, Rabbi Eliezer said in the name of Rabbi Rav, you are to do X. Okay. They didn't in themselves have the authority. They have to cite their rabbinic authority to do that. And of course, Jesus doesn't do that. The only authority he ever cites is what? The Old Testament and God. Yeah, I say what the Father says. He doesn't ever say, blah, 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 this person, I get my authority. And so the reaction that you get from the people is, where does he get his authority? He speaks like no one we've ever heard before. Everyone else has to have to tell where they got their authority from. This one speaks as if the authority comes from himself. And that ticked off the Pharisees.
And they called him rabbi. They called him-
They did. Some did, yes. Some did, yes.
Came to the synagogue before his, 3 year, his 3 year ministry.
We don't have any records. What we have is we have his birth record. We have his birth record. We have the record when he's 12. And then we have his record when he comes for his baptism. Right. So the lost years of Jesus, we don't know what he was doing. I'll be honest with you. My theory is no, he did not, because the baptism was his introduction of his ministry. Until then, he was probably unknown to anybody. Right. Now we know that the Old Testament says that he was taught, woke up by God would wake him up daily and would teach him daily. So up until the time that he was baptized, he was being taught by the Father what his role in ministry was. We get that from the Old Testament, not from the New. But it wasn't until his baptism that then he has this public ministry. So it's now, as he's growing up or whatever else, was there maybe a chance in the synagogue for him to read something or whatever else? Possibly. I'm not going to say no, but likely if he did, no one knew any difference. I mean, it was just Joe on the street. Yeah,
Brad, you seem to have all the answers.
I don't.
What happened to Joseph?
We don't know. Bible doesn't say. Bible doesn't say. We don't have any idea what happened to Joseph.
Well, all of this other history you've given, which is not in the Bible, but it's in history somewhere.
But we don't know Joseph. What we do know, well, when Jesus is being crucified, he hands his mother over to the Apostle John. Well, you only do that if she doesn't have a husband, right? I mean, so you can kind of look at the data and say, by the time Christ is crucified, we don't have any, Joseph doesn't seem to be on the scene. So very likely Joseph is already dead at that point. All right. What other questions or comments? Okay. So next week, I swear next week, we're going to start off. I don't swear, actually, sorry. I promise you that next week, we are going to start off with answering Jeff's questions. And we're going to go through how this progression of the oral law happened. And we're going to do that the first little bit. And then we're going to get into the Gospels. We're going to start out by talking about the 4 gospel accounts. Who wrote them? What was their audience and what was their purpose? Because if you've ever asked the question, why are there 4 gospels? I mean, look, sometimes by the time you get to, Luke, you're like, I don't know, I've read that I don't know, I've read it. So what's the purpose, God? What is the purpose, God, of 4 gospels? So we're going to answer the question of the purpose for that. And then you're going to see that those purposes flow throughout the entire gospel. Hopefully you'll start reading Luke and you'll be like, I see it, I see it, I see it, I see it. So that will be what we start talking about next week.
Would that be in Acts as well? Because he wrote Acts.
Well, I'm talking about the Gospels here. So Acts is Luke part 2, but we're only talking about the Gospel accounts here. Yeah.
And by the way, love is patient. Love is
All right. So
we'll see you next week.
Does anyone want to close in prayer? Anybody want to close in prayer? All right. Thanks, Mikey.
Father, thank you for this gathering here tonight and these people who love you and want to learn more of you and come to know you, God. And thank you for Randy's teaching. It's exciting, it's energetic, and it's fun. Lord, put on our hearts your love and give us the knowledge that you want us to have so we can touch other people's lives. I pray this in his name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you online. Appreciate it.
What? Yeah. George,